Carlo is the most relaxed manager I ever met in my life, one of the best people you can meet.
When everything around you is falling apart, what do you do? Do you shout? Do you panic? Do you start changing everything? Or do you stay still long enough to see what everyone else is missing? For decades, Carlo Ancelotti has stood on football's biggest stages while the pressure around him became almost unbearable. Champions League finals, dressing rooms full of superstars, impossible comebacks, expectations that can crush managers in weeks. And yet, Ancelotti rarely looks like a man fighting the pressure. He looks like a man who has already accepted it. And perhaps that's why his calmness is so interesting. Because maybe it isn't simply a personality trait. Maybe calm is his weapon. Most people think calm means you don't care. But Ancelotti's career suggests the opposite. He cares enormously. He just doesn't allow emotion to make every decision for him. And that difference can change everything. Because when pressure rises, the first thing people lose isn't talent. It's clarity. And if a leader loses clarity, the people around them often lose it too. So the question isn't simply, why does Ancelotti never panic? The real question is, how does one man's calmness help an entire team perform when the world around them is losing control? Because Ancelotti hasn't spent his career managing ordinary players. He's managed some of the strongest personalities football has ever produced. And that creates a completely different leadership problem. How do you lead people who already believe they're exceptional? Take Cristiano Ronaldo. Ronaldo didn't need someone to tell him he could become great. He already believed it. His entire identity was built around improvement. Goals. Records. Winning. Being the best. That confidence helped create one of the greatest players in football history. But confidence can become complicated when you're managing a team. Because every superstar has an ego. An ego isn't automatically bad. In fact, ambition often requires it. The problem begins when individual identity becomes more important than collective identity. So Ancelotti faced a delicate problem. He didn't need to destroy Ronaldo's ego. He needed to give it direction. That's a completely different approach to leadership. You don't always control an ambitious person by making them smaller. Sometimes, you make the mission bigger. Instead of saying, stop wanting to be the best, you say, use that desire to make the team better. And that's useful far beyond football. The ambitious employee doesn't need less ambition. They need a reason for that ambition to serve something larger. The talented student doesn't need less confidence. They need responsibility. The entrepreneur doesn't need to stop believing in themselves. They need to understand when their ego is protecting the idea. And when it's protecting themselves. Ancelotti's genius was often knowing the difference. But Ronaldo wasn't the only kind of personality Ancelotti had to manage. Luka Modrić and Toni Kroos represented something completely different. They didn't dominate through emotion. They dominated through intelligence, patience, control, awareness. And this reveals another important part of Ancelotti's leadership. He doesn't appear obsessed with making every player behave the same way. Because treating everyone identically isn't necessarily good leadership. A young player might need confidence. A superstar might need freedom. A veteran might need responsibility. A struggling player might need trust. The principle stays the same. The method changes. That's a difficult balance. Because leadership isn't about controlling every person. It's about creating an environment where different people can move toward the same goal. And this is where Ancelotti's calmness becomes important. Because trust requires restraint. If you constantly interfere, people stop thinking for themselves. If every mistake produces an explosion, people start playing to avoid punishment. And eventually, you don't have a team. You have people waiting for instructions. Think about what happens when a player knows that every mistake will be punished. The brain starts asking a different question. Not, what's the best decision? But, what happens if I'm wrong? That small psychological change can completely alter performance. You hesitate. You become conservative. You avoid responsibility. You stop taking the risk that the situation requires. And that's why psychological safety matters in high-performance environments. Not because standards should disappear, but because people need enough security to make decisions. Ancelotti's calm doesn't mean mistakes don't matter. It means mistakes don't automatically become emotional disasters. And that's a powerful distinction. Nowhere is this more visible than in Real Madrid's Champions League comebacks. The goals are what history remembers. But the goals aren't the most interesting part. The most interesting part is what happens before them. A team is behind. The clock is disappearing. The opponent believes they've survived. The stadium becomes desperate. And yet, Real Madrid continues. One run. One pass. One challenge. One decision. Then another. And another. Until suddenly, the impossible doesn't look quite so impossible. That's what belief really looks like. It isn't always, we're definitely going to win. Sometimes it's simply, we still can. And that difference matters. You don't need certainty to keep acting. You need possibility. As long as the players believe the situation can still change, they continue making decisions that could change it. And that's where Ancelotti's calm becomes important. Because panic tells you, everything is going wrong. Calm asks, what can we still do? One shuts down possibilities. The other searches for them. There is a psychological reason this matters. Under pressure, attention narrows. The world becomes smaller. You stop seeing possibilities. You see the mistake. The scoreboard. The clock. The danger. The fear. And when that happens, people react instead of think. But a calm leader can create something incredibly valuable. Space. Not physical space. Mental space. The space to process what is happening. The space to make another decision. The space to believe the game isn't finished. An emotion spread. If the leader panics, the team receives another source of pressure. If the leader stays composed, the team has one less problem to solve. That's why calm isn't weakness. Calm protects decision-making. Think about the pattern in Madrid's greatest European nights. The situation becomes chaotic. But chaos doesn't necessarily produce chaos inside the team. Someone keeps communicating. Someone keeps running. Someone takes responsibility. Someone refuses to accept that the match is over. And eventually, collective belief becomes visible. This is called collective efficacy. The belief that we can solve this together. And that belief doesn't appear from nowhere. It is built over time. Through previous experiences. Through trust. Through shared standards. Through leaders who don't collapse when things go wrong. That's another reason Ancelotti's leadership is so fascinating. He doesn't always need to be the emotional center of the team. He doesn't need every player constantly looking toward him. Because eventually, the players have to lead themselves. They have to communicate. They have to make decisions. They have to recover from mistakes. They have to control their emotions. And that's the real test of leadership. Not, what happens when I'm here? But, what happens because I was here? If everything collapses when the leader disappears, the leader built dependence. But if the team continues functioning, the leader built capability. The 2024 Champions League season offered another example. Real Madrid entered the competition with enormous expectations. At Madrid, simply being competitive isn't enough. Winning is expected. And when winning becomes an expectation, pressure changes. Every mistake is magnified. Every poor performance becomes a debate. Every elimination becomes a crisis. Yet Ancelotti once again created something remarkably stable. Not perfection. Stability. And there's an important difference. A stable team can still have bad moments. It can still make mistakes. It can still look vulnerable. But one bad moment doesn't automatically become a psychological collapse. That's resilience. Not pretending the problem isn't there. Not telling yourself everything will be fine. It's being able to experience something going wrong, without allowing it to determine everything that happens next. And that's a skill every person needs. You fail an exam. You can say, "I'm not good enough." Or, "What do I need to change?" Your business loses money. You can panic. Or, "What can I still control?" You lose an opportunity. You can turn rejection into an identity. Or you can treat it as information. The event is real. But your response determines what happens next. And that's one of Ancelotti's biggest lessons. You cannot always control the pressure. But you can control whether pressure controls you. But there's a misconception here. People often confuse calmness with passivity. They think the calm person doesn't care. That isn't what Ancelotti demonstrates. He cares deeply. He simply doesn't need to display every emotion. That's emotional control. Not the absence of emotion. The ability to experience emotion, without allowing it to become the decision maker. Fear can be present, without making the decision. Anger can be present, without controlling the response. Doubt can be present, without ending the attempt. That's much harder than simply staying positive. Because positivity says, everything will be fine. Calm says, whatever happens, I can still think. That's stronger. And this is where Ancelotti stops being just a football story. Imagine you're leading a company. Your biggest client leaves. Everyone looks at you. If you panic, your team feels it. If you stay calm, you give them room to think. Imagine you're a student. You have 1 hour before an important exam. Panic won't give you more knowledge. It will only make it harder to use what you already know. Imagine you're an athlete. You make a mistake at the worst possible moment. You can't undo it. The only useful question is, what happens next? That's the power of the pause. The space between the event and the response. Most people live inside the first step. Something happens, and they react. High performers learn to create the second. The pause. That tiny moment where you decide, what deserves my emotion? What deserves my attention? What can I control? And what should I do next? Ancelotti's career is full of moments where that pause appears. And maybe that's why his calmness has survived different clubs, different generations, different football eras. Because tactics change. Players change. Football changes. Human psychology doesn't change nearly as quickly. People still fear failure. They still struggle with pressure. They still want recognition. They still react emotionally. And they still perform better when they believe the person leading them can handle the moment. That's perhaps the most impressive part. Ancelotti never needed every player to become like him. Ronaldo remained Ronaldo. Modrić remained Modrić. Kroos remained Kroos. Different personalities. Different strengths. Different identities. But they could still function inside the same environment. Because the goal wasn't to make everyone identical. It was to make everyone responsible. And responsibility changes people. When something becomes yours, you protect it differently. You fight for it differently. You think about it differently. The player stops asking, "What does the manager want?" and starts asking, "What does the team need from me?" That's the moment leadership becomes internal. Imagine Ancelotti isn't there. No instructions. No shouting. No one watching. Do the standards disappear? Or have the players internalized them? That's the ultimate test. Because the greatest leaders don't create teams that need them forever. They create people who can function without them. And maybe that's why Ancelotti's greatest achievement isn't any individual trophy. It's the environment he repeatedly creates around talented people. An environment where confidence doesn't have to become arrogance. Where mistakes don't have to become disasters. Where pressure doesn't automatically become panic. And where superstars can remain themselves, while still serving something bigger. People will remember the trophies. The Champions Leagues. The comebacks. The superstars. The nights that became history. But trophies are the visible part of leadership. The invisible part is what happens to people. Do they become more resilient? More responsible? More confident? Better under pressure? Better at making decisions? If they do, then something much bigger than football has been built. Perhaps that's the paradox of Carlo Ancelotti. The man who looks like he is doing less may actually be controlling more. He doesn't need to control every player. He controls the environment. He doesn't eliminate pressure. He prevents pressure from becoming panic. He doesn't demand that everyone become like him. He creates enough trust for everyone to become the best version of themselves. And perhaps that's what real leadership looks like. Not being the loudest person in the room. Not having an answer for everything. Not pretending you're never afraid. But remaining clear enough when everyone else is struggling to think. Because pressure is inevitable. At some point, everyone faces it. A business fails. A relationship changes. An opportunity disappears. A plan collapses. A mistake becomes public. And in that moment, you don't get to choose where the pressure arrives. But you do get to choose what happens next. Do you panic? Or do you pause? Do you react? Or do you respond? Do you let the moment define you? Or do you give yourself enough space to decide what comes next? Maybe that's why Ancelotti never needed to look like the most powerful man on the touchline. Because power doesn't always look like control. Sometimes it looks like composure. Sometimes it looks like trust. And sometimes the strongest person in the room is simply the person calm enough for everyone else to think. Because maybe the real lesson of Carlo Ancelotti isn't how to win when everything goes right. It's how to remain yourself when everything starts going wrong. And perhaps that's when calm becomes power.